I would like to thank OCBC for inviting me and give me this very good opportunity to be here and share some of my personal view on the tension between China and the United States. Now the whole world is holding their breath, watching the trade war between the two largest economies. And China and the United States has imposed a tit-for-tat tariff of 34 billion on each other's product. And there's another 16 billion on the road. And Mr. Trump threat that if China retaliates, and there will be another additional 200 billion. So it seems that the escalation of the tension is building up. So what will be the final result? At the end of the day, what will be the end of the game look like? I would like to share some of my personal observations. We need to distinguish two trade wars between China and the United States. So one is Trump's war, Trump's trade war with China. And second is the US trade war with China. So the first war is relatively easy to handle, but then the second war is more messy and tricky and will last longer. And first, let's talk about Mr. Trump's war, trade war with China. I have to admit that China had made quite a lot of misjudgment on Mr. Trump. China didn't think Trump will become president for good reason, because people like him, if he was in China, will have no chance to be promoted even at a lower level government official. But American is an amazing country, so we have President Trump. And then Chinese people think, well, we have a businessman like president, and we like a businessman, so let's make a deal. But it proved that Mr. Trump is not the businessman in Chinese people's mind. And then we thought that for the two leaders, President Xi Jinping and President Trump, they are quite a different personality. So there's no way that they can build friendship. But I don't know for what reason that they have chemistry with each other. So that's why President Trump always say, my good friend, Xi Jinping. So we thought we have solved the problem. So if they are good friends and there'll be no trade war. But look at what happened recently. So there is, the case of ZTE, and then the 301, and then the tariff, the newly imposed tariff on Chinese export. And why China always make wrong judgment on Mr. Trump? Because we don't have the experience dealing with such kind of people in that position. But then if you look at Mr. Trump from a different angle, and then you have good reason to believe that he's quite predictable, because he's already in his 70s. And it's very difficult to change your personality when you're at your 70s. So how can we predict the behavior of Mr. Trump? You have to bear in mind that he's a kind of narcissist with ADHD. So he can focus on one thing at one moment, but there's no way that he can concentrate for more than 20 minutes, or maybe 5 minutes, I don't know. So there's no way that he can have long-term plan or strategy. You know, that's the reason why Chinese people always make a wrong judgment, because we Chinese people are very sophisticated. When we heard what Mr. Trump said, and we try to understand what is the real meaning. So please do not do that. So if you hear what Trump said, you just take it literally. I mean, literally. When he said that he wants to build a wall between United States and the Mexican, do not think, what is his real meaning? Is he want to tighten the border control or to reform the immigrant policy? No, he wants a wall built by brick and cement. So if we change the angle that we're looking at Mr. Trump, that's the reason why I believe this trade war is more easy to be handled with. Look at what, the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un do with Mr. Trump. There is a lesson that we can learn, China can learn. We tended to underestimate the IQ of Kim Jong-un. He's very smart. He's outsmart that of Mr. Trump. So he knew exactly what Mr. Trump wanted. He wanted a meeting. He wanted the handshaking. He wanted to take pictures. Okay, so Kim Jong-un will offer everything that Mr. Trump wanted. And then they have a statement with very, empty content, but who cares? Maybe 2 months later or 2 weeks later, and Mr. Trump will forget all about that, and then we'll move on to another issue, another topic. So I think the best choice for China right now, you cannot underestimate a people like Mr. Trump, his will and his eagerness to win the so-called trade war. But then you can make some compromise. And it's very easy for him, you make some small compromise, and then he'll be very easy to claim victory. And then we can move on. And then we can move the negotiation back on the normal track. I'll give you another case. You look at the Chinese company ZTE, which was accused of doing business with Iran government. And then actually China made some compromise in the case of ZTE. But then look at what happened after that. And Mr. Trump is using his personal political resources and defending ZTE at the U.S. Congress. I don't know what is happening. So this is the lesson that we can learn, how to deal with Trump's war with China. But what is more difficult is, the tension between China and the United States. And this I agree with, Andrew and other colleagues. So they have very correctly mentioned that this is not just the trade imbalance. It has more profound reason, underlining reason. Because the main reason is because, the rising of the Chinese power, economic and mainly economic power. So if we only look at the bilateral trade relationship, and then, the bilateral economic relation grew very rapidly in the last 2 or 3 decades. And the trade structure between the economic structure between the two economies are supplementary, not competitive with each other. What China is doing is producing cheap products, and then we sell it to the United States. We bring the inflationary pressure, the inflationary level in United States very low, so we can, allow the Fed to lower the interest rate and to stimulate the American economy. And at the same time, we accumulate the foreign exchange reserve, and then we're using the dollar to buy T-bills to further support our good friend, United States. So there is nothing to blame for this bilateral relationship. But then the more fundamental reason is the concern of a rising, new power. And in Washington, D.C., a lot of people are rethinking what Mr. Clinton has said when he encouraged the American people, the American Congress, to support China to enter the WTO. So he mainly made 2 points. One, the reason why U.S. should support China, because U.S. has paid no price. So it's mainly China, at that time it's mainly China make compromise. And he was right in this point. And the second is, he argued that by integrating China into the international community, and China will become more like the Western world. And that didn't happen. So Americans are quite frustrated. And that didn't happen for two reasons. One reason is, the style of the different generation of leadership in China is quite different. The former generation leadership in China, Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji, and they were educated in the foreign, in a church school, and they can speak fluent English. So they have this idea that China will be a normal member of the international community. But then the current generation leadership and their personal experience and their educational background and also the value that they cherish are quite different from the previous generation. But then down the track, if you look into the future, I think Clinton is correct that the younger generation in China and their behavior and their value will be more or less the same as the younger generation in the United States. But the one thing that American hasn't predicted is, what if China become a country more like United States, but with a GDP at the same size or even larger? Say 1.5 times that of the United States. This is not what Mr. Clinton predicted. This is the tension between China and the United States. And also, fundamentally, between the two countries, it's a strategically mistrust and misunderstanding. So neither country can convince the other country. For Chinese government, their main concern is United States one day, and they will overthrow the ruling of Chinese Communist Party. But then if you go to Washington, D.C. and talk with any sensible person, and they will tell you they don't have the plan, and they have other issues to worry about. The immigration policy, the separation of family, that's the big news in the United States. But China was not fully convinced. If you do not have this hidden agenda, how come that you always criticize the human rights condition in China, how you're always making trouble on issues like Taiwan and Tibet? And for some American, their main concern is one day China will grow up and then it will replace the United States as the leader of the international community. But if you go to Beijing and talk with any reasonable people, and they will tell you, we don't have the plan. We have other issues to worry about. The anti-corruption campaign, the air pollution, and these are the things that we care about. But United States is not fully convinced. If you do not have the plan, so why you have this Road and Belt Initiative? Why you build an AIIB? So what's your real intention? And because of this mutual mistrust, it's very difficult to solve the problem between China and the United States. And if you, by closer examination, you can find that there were actually two camps surrounding Mr. Trump. So one I called deficit camp. So those people argued that the trade deficit is a problem. I don't think they really care about the trade deficit because, except Mr. Trump, who has his education of economics, if he has, back in the 1960s. So he's still, have this mercantilism view that this number, the trade deficit, matters. But then if you look at the globalization, if you look at the supply chain, the production network, the sheer number of trade deficit is irrelevant. But the reason why this camp focuses on trade deficit, because they think that by forcing China to reduce the trade surplus, and by forcing China to buy more American products, it will make a pressure on China So China has to reform its domestic economic policy, has to, to create more market access for American investors. But then the problem is this goal is in contradiction to other concerns in the United States. If China continue to buy more American products, and then we have to buy more high technology products, Americans say no. We don't want to sell those high technology to you because of security concerns. And another camp is what I call tariff camp. So this group of people believe that you cannot change China. So forget about it. China will never change. So the best way that we can do is protect American interest by imposing tariff, and also punish China for their unfair practice. And later, after the case of ZTE, they found they have policy tools even better than tariff. So now they are using more and more, not a tariff, but restriction on investment. So probably in the future, there will be more cases like ZTE. So any Chinese company that they are investing in the United States, whether you are investing in high technology or not, and whether, regardless of the share in the merger and the acquisition, even you are doing a green land investment, and the United States will say, no, this is prohibited because of concern of national security. So American is becoming more and more like Chinese government used to do. So, and the problem why I think it's more difficult to deal with this tension between China and the United States is mainly because even in the United States, there's no concern that what they really want from China. As Deputy Premier Liu He went to United States early this year, actually he was looking for a list what American wants from China. And if you can have the list, and then we can put that list on the negotiation table, right? What kind of gift do you want? Do you want a watch or a diamond ring? So just tell me, and I write a check, okay? But Americans say, I don't know, surprise me. So if there's no consensus in the United States, what they really want from China, how can China satisfy the United States? So that's one issue. And you look at the claims from the United States, and they say, well, China has this, government document, government policy, China manufacturing 2025, and they are using all kinds of government policies, subsidy and whatever, SOE to support high technology. Any people who understand China will know that for that kind of government document, I myself can write it within 1 week. So it's only a very ordinary government document, and it's still a far way for the implementation of all these specific policies. So I was wondering whether, Bannon and I are reading the same document. So, but then they think, well, because China will put more resources in developing those high-end technology, and then finally, at the end of the day, China will become a real rivalry to the United States. But the good thing is, even there will be more tension between China and the United States, but then I totally agree with Andrew that there's no way that United States can stop China from rising. For the simple reason because of the sheer size of the Chinese economy. So what will be the impact of this so-called trade war between China and the United States? Well, for the time being, the impact is not very significant. Because when you increase the tariff, there will not be a one-to-one pass through to the price of the exported products. And some scholars has estimated that this pass-through ratio is somewhere between 10% to 30%. And then you need to calculate the elasticity of price. So the change of prices, to what extent will influence the demand? And again, according to the estimation of scholars, the price elasticity of China's export is somewhere between 2 and 6. So assume that the pass-through ratio is somewhere like 20%, and assume the price elasticity is 4. And by rough calculation, and we can have the result that by imposing tariff, and it will have negative impact on China's export by something like 15%. And if we take a 34 billion, and the result will be something like 5 billion. But then if there'll be continued additional tariffs, and then the impact will be much larger than we predicted. So if I can take a bet, and I'm relatively optimistic that the full-blown trade war between China and the United States will not happen. For the reason one, because we have the supply chain. So the supply chain now in global economy is like a nuclear weapon. It's mutually destructive. If you have this trade war, and then you have backfire, and then you hurt yourself. And second, I think that Chinese government is very pragmatic, and if you look at the announcement of the Chinese government recently, and you can have the sense that they are trying to be very restrained. So, for example, even if there's an additional 200 billion, I don't think that China will have an equal amount for the retaliation. And if you calculate 200 billion, and that will be 35% of China's export to the United States. And then if you take 35% and calculate American export to China, there's only something like 45 billion. So maybe if there's 200 billion, and then China will say, we'll attack, we'll impose tariff for something like 45 billion. And Mr. Trump can claim, okay, we win the trade war, and hopefully. But more important, I think, maybe this is a good opportunity for China to rethink its development strategy. In China, reform is always induced by sort of crisis, external pressure. So it's also, if the Chinese government can utilize this opportunity, and then I think there's still quite a lot of room for maneuver, and there's still things that we can do. And if I can list the 3 most important reform, I would like to say 1, SOE reform, and 2, the land reform, and 3, the property tax, the reform of the taxation system. SOE reform, because if you look at the non-performing loan, that's mainly coming from state-owned enterprises. If you look at the very high leverage ratio, that's mainly coming from state-owned enterprises. If you look at the accumulated debt level, that's mainly coming from state-owned enterprises. So we have all good reason to reform state-owned enterprises. And I think only Xi Jinping can reform state-owned enterprises. When I studied economics, I remember there was a very influential paper called "Only Nixon Can Come to China," because Nixon coming from the right wing. So if Nixon come to China, he can convince American that he came to China for the interest of American, not for his personal interest, right? If you ask another people, say Edgar Snow to come to China, and people will doubt what's your real intention. By the same token, we can argue only President Xi Jinping can reform as we reform. No one will question what's your intention, right? And second reform is the land reform, because now a lot of farmers, they own their own land, and then they can build a house on the land, and they can live in their house. But there is no way, it's illegal for them to sell their land, to rent there to other people, or to use the land as collateral to borrow money from the banks. By reforming the rural land system, we can unleash the potential of urbanization in China. And third reform is property tax, for the reason because will mainly be a new resources for the local government revenue. And then we can, pave the long way for the long-term development of the local government, the urbanization and the local government, the physical system. So apart from domestic reform, another thing that China needs to do is we have to make up our mind how we can contribute to the international order, international economic and also political order. And for China, the best solution is always multilateralism. So that's the reason why we still support the WTO. And if WTO is dead, as many Americans said, and maybe we can have a new set of international order. I don't think China is strongly opposed to the idea of higher standard like TPP. If you look at the bilateral investment treaty between China and the United States, actually the very sensitive issues which are included in TPP are already in BIT negotiation. So if China can accept the term of BIT negotiation, there is no problem that we can have this TPP negotiation. So I think my understanding is, as long as for those new international rule, new international organization, as long as China is a founding member, from the very beginning, China is on the negotiation table, China will be satisfied with that. Because compared with this bilateral relationship, multilateralism is always better for China's own interest. So to end up, I think for the time being, we haven't seen a full-blown trade war between the two largest economies. We haven't come to the worst scenario. The worst scenario is the trade war in the 1930s when the global trade has dropped by something like 40% and dragged the world economy into a prolonged recession. We haven't come to that situation. But we don't know what will happen, because as the great philosopher Hegel has said, the only lesson we learn from history is we learn nothing from history. So please fasten your seatbelt and let's cross our fingers. I'll finish. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.